They're cooked, and revenge is a dish best served cold.
The enslaved woman who took revenge on her owner. The secret that shook Boston. 1821. She was worth $1,200. That's what the ledger said when Master Harrison Cavendish purchased her in 1805. Patience Willard, age 18, experienced cook, docile temperament, no history of running. A bargain at that price, he told his wife Elizabeth over breakfast the morning after the transaction. The woman didn't even look up when he inspected her teeth. 16 years later, on a cold December night in 1821, Patience Willard would prove that docility can be the most dangerous mask a person wears, and the 5 members of the Cavendish family would learn, in their final hours, that some debts demand payment in methods far beyond money. But this story doesn't begin on that December night. It begins on an August afternoon, 4 months earlier, at Boston's Long Wharf, where Patience stood watching a ship disappear into the harbor mist. On that ship were the only 2 things in the world she loved. Her daughter Mercy, 16 years old, screaming her mother's name from the deck. Her son Samuel, 13, gagged and bound, tears streaming down his face as he was dragged below deck. Both sold to a Charleston slave trader to cover the gambling debts of Harrison Cavendish Jr., the master's eldest son. Patience had run to the wharf when she discovered they were gone, had run through the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill in her kitchen apron, her hands still covered in flour from the morning bread. She reached the dock just as the ropes were being cast off. "Mercy!" she screamed. "Samuel!" Her daughter's voice carried across the water one last time before the ship turned south, carrying Patience's children toward the cotton fields of South Carolina, carrying them toward a life so brutal that Massachusetts had officially abolished such slavery 38 years earlier. But laws, Patience had learned, meant nothing when money was involved. 2 dock workers grabbed her before she could throw herself into the harbor, dragged her back from the edge, back from the water, back from the only thing she wanted in that moment, which was to drown rather than live another second in this world that could steal children from their mother's arms and call it legal. They brought her back to the Cavendish mansion on Mount Vernon Street. Master Harrison was in his study, reviewing shipping manifests. He didn't even look up when the workers deposited Patience at his door. "The negress tried to jump in the harbor, sir," one of them reported. "Thought you should know. Tie her in the cellar until she calms down," Harrison said, turning a page. "No supper tonight. She needs to learn her place." But it was Mistress Elizabeth who came to the cellar that evening. Elizabeth Cavendish, 52 years old, known throughout Beacon Hill for her charitable work with the Boston Female Asylum, for her regular attendance at Park Street Church, for her impeccable taste in French furniture. She stood in the doorway of the cellar where Patience sat tied to a support beam, and she smiled. A small, cold smile that held no warmth, no humanity, no recognition that she was looking at another human being. "You should be grateful," Elizabeth said. "Those children were expensive to feed. Mercy was getting to the age where she'd need proper clothing if we kept her here. Samuel ate like a grown man. They're worth more in the South anyway. We got an excellent price, far more than they were worth to us." Patience said nothing, just stared at the woman who'd watched Mercy take her first steps, who'd accepted Samuel's handmade birthday cards every year, who'd eaten food prepared by Patience's hands for 16 years. Stared and said absolutely nothing. "I expect you back in the kitchen tomorrow morning at 5, Elizabeth continued. "The Johnsons are coming for dinner Friday, and you know how particular Mrs. Johnson is about the soup course. I trust this little episode won't affect the quality of your work." She left. The cellar door closed. The lock clicked. And in the darkness, something in Patience Willard died. The part of her that had spent 16 years being perfect, being obedient, being the kind of enslaved woman that Massachusetts families could keep and still tell themselves they were better than their southern cousins. That part died. What remained was something much older, something that remembered a name from before Patience, a name from the Akan people of the Gold Coast, Amara, the name her mother had given her before the slavers came, the name that meant grace in a language she'd almost forgotten. And grace, Patience remembered as she sat in that cellar, wasn't always gentle. Sometimes grace was the strength to do what needed to be done. The next morning, Patience returned to the kitchen at 5 o'clock as ordered. Her eyes were dry, her hands were steady. She prepared breakfast exactly as she always did. Perfectly scrambled eggs, bacon crisped to ideal doneness, fresh bread still warm from the oven, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Master Harrison complimented the meal. Mistress Elizabeth mentioned that the strawberry preserves were particularly good this year. Patience said, "Thank you, mistress," in the same quiet voice she'd used for 16 years, and she began to plan. The Cavendish household ran like clockwork, and Patience knew every tick and turn of that clock. She'd worked in this kitchen since she was 18 years old. She knew that Master Harrison took his afternoon constitutional at 3 o'clock every day, walking down to the common and back. She knew that Mistress Elizabeth hosted her ladies' charitable society every Tuesday afternoon in the drawing room, where they discussed ways to help the less fortunate while drinking imported tea from china cups. She knew that the 3 Cavendish children, all adults now, lived in the mansion and maintained their own schedules that she'd memorized years ago. Harrison Jr., 31, left for his shipping office at 8 every morning and returned at 6, unless he was gambling at the Union Club, which was 3 nights a week. Thomas, 28, managed the family's real estate holdings and spent most afternoons visiting properties around Boston. Margaret, 26, was unmarried and spent her days painting watercolors, hosting friends and complaining about the quality of servants in Boston. But there was one ritual Patience had observed with particular interest. On the 3rd Friday of every month, all 5 adult Cavendishes gathered for what they called a family business dinner. They locked themselves in the private dining room off the main hallway, the small room that was never used for entertaining guests. No servants were allowed inside. Food was left on a cart outside the door and they served themselves. They discussed finances, property matters, family secrets, things they didn't want staff overhearing. The tradition had started years ago, after a servant at another Beacon Hill mansion had sold information about the family's debts to competitors. Now the Boston elite kept their business discussions completely private. The irony, Patience thought as she began to formulate her plan, was that privacy could cut both ways. She had 4 months until the next family business dinner in December. 4 months to prepare. 4 months to become even more perfect, even more invisible, even more trusted than she already was. 4 months to gather what she needed. The Cavendish mansion had extensive gardens, maintained by 2 Irish gardeners who knew plants but didn't ask questions. Among the ornamental shrubs were monkshood flowers, beautiful purple blooms that Elizabeth loved for their dramatic appearance. The gardeners warned her every spring, "Don't touch these without gloves, missus. They're deadly poison." Elizabeth always laughed. How theatrical, as if flowers could hurt anyone. Patience began collecting monkshood roots during her morning herb gathering. Just small amounts dried and ground to powder, hidden in a jar labeled cinnamon in the back of the spice cabinet. She also collected foxglove from the cutting garden, oleander from the greenhouse that Margaret used for her still life paintings. Separately, each plant was dangerous. Combined in precise ratios, they created something Patience had learned about from an elderly woman during her first years in Boston. An African woman who'd remembered medicine from home, both the healing kind and the other kind. The mixture caused complete paralysis, but kept the victim conscious, unable to move, unable to speak, but aware, feeling everything, seeing everything. For 2 to 3 hours, depending on dosage and body weight. Patience tested it first on rats that infested the cellar, adjusted the ratios, calculated dosages based on weight. Master Harrison was approximately 170 pounds. Harrison Jr. was a stocky 200. Thomas, lean and tall, maybe 165. Margaret and Elizabeth were both slender, perhaps 130 each. Patience measured out 5 separate portions, wrote nothing down, kept it all in her head, in the photographic memory that had made her such an exceptional cook. Recipes she'd learned long ago didn't need to be written to be remembered perfectly. September passed. Patience cooked flawlessly. October came. She prepared a birthday dinner for Master Harrison that had guests talking for weeks about the quality of the roast duck. November arrived cold and early. Patience baked Thanksgiving pies that Margaret declared were the best I've ever tasted. December began with snow, and on the 3rd Friday of December, Patience prepared for the family business dinner with particular care. She made her famous lamb stew, the one the Cavendish family requested repeatedly. Rich red wine broth, tender meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork, root vegetables cooked to perfect softness, herbs that filled the house with warmth and comfort. She'd made this dish 100 times. The family loved it specifically because the robust flavors were so complex, so layered with wine and rosemary and thyme, that every spoonful was an experience. Those complex flavors also masked anything else that might be in the pot. The bitter edge of monkshood, the slight metallic tang of foxglove, the faint soapy note of oleander. All of it disappeared into the wine and herbs, undetectable even to a careful palate. At 6:45, patients placed the serving tureen on the cart outside the private dining room, along with a basket of fresh bread, a bowl of butter, and 5 clean bowls. She knocked on the door as always. "Dinner is served," she called. Master Harrison's voice came through the door. "Excellent. That stew, I hope?" "Yes, sir. Your favorite." "Wonderful. Leave it there. We'll serve ourselves." Patients returned to the kitchen. The other household staff, 2 Irish maids and an elderly butler, had been given the evening off. The family preferred complete privacy for their business dinners, which meant Patience was alone in the mansion's service areas. Alone to wait. Alone to listen. At 7:47, she heard the first heavy thud from the private dining room, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession, bodies hitting the floor. Patience wiped her hands on her apron, walked calmly down the hallway and used the master key she'd copied 2 months earlier. The door opened silently on hinges she'd oiled that morning. All 5 Cavendish family members were conscious. Their eyes tracked her movement as she entered. Master Harrison had fallen forward onto the table, his face turned toward the door, unable to move anything except his eyes, which were wide with terror and understanding. Harrison Jr. had slid from his chair onto the floor, landing on his side. Thomas had collapsed backward, staring at the ceiling. Margaret and Elizabeth had both pitched forward onto the table, their faces inches apart. Mother and daughter frozen in identical expressions of horror. Patience looked at each of them in turn. Then she spoke, and for the first time in 16 years, her voice held no deference, no submission, no mask. "You can hear me, you can see me, you can feel everything, but you cannot move, cannot speak, cannot do anything but experience what comes next." She walked to where Master Harrison lay on the table, bent down so her face was level with his terrified eyes. "Do you remember August, 4 months ago, when you sold my children? When you sold Mercy and Samuel to Charleston?" His eyes screamed. His mouth moved infinitesimally. No sound emerged except a faint gurgling. "I remember," Patience continued softly. "I remember watching the ship leave. I remember Mercy screaming for me. I remember Samuel's face. I remember your wife telling me I should be grateful." She straightened up, looked around the room at the 5 frozen figures. "Tonight, you're going to understand what you took from me. You're going to understand that enslaved people are not property, we're not animals. We're human beings who love our children the same way you love yours. And when you steal our children, when you sell them like furniture, there are consequences." Patience had spent months preparing the kitchen for this night. The largest cooking pot the household owned was a massive copper kettle used for rendering lard and making soup for large parties. It held 40 gallons and was deep enough that a person could crouch inside if they were bent double. She'd positioned it on the largest iron stove, built up the fire throughout the afternoon, and filled it with pork oil, the same oil she used for frying chicken and fish. The oil was now at 375 degrees, bubbling gently, ready for cooking. One by one, using a combination of rope, a pulley system normally used for moving sides of beef, and the desperate strength of a mother who'd lost everything, Patience transported the paralyzed Cavendish family members from the dining room to the kitchen. She started with Harrison Jr., dragging his heavy body across the floor, heaving him onto a wooden pallet, using the pulley to lift him. His eyes rolled in their sockets, tears streaming down his paralyzed face, unable to scream, unable to beg, unable to do anything but understand what was about to happen. What happened in that kitchen over the next 2 hours cannot be described in explicit detail, not because it didn't happen, but because some horrors are better understood through their consequences than their mechanisms. Patience had learned to cook over 16 years, had learned that different meats required different temperatures, different timing, had learned that oil at 375 degrees would cook flesh instantly, would cause pain beyond any description, would transform living tissue into something else entirely. She made sure each family member watched what happened to the others before their turn came, made sure they understood this was methodical, not madness, made sure they knew why. Harrison Jr. went first because he'd signed the papers. Thomas went second because he'd chosen the buyer. Margaret went third because she'd called Mercy and Samuel ugly mongrel children, and said the house was better without them. Elizabeth went forth because she'd stood in that cellar and told Patience to be grateful. Master Harrison went last. Patience wanted him to watch his entire family die first, wanted him to understand the complete destruction of his line, wanted him to spend his final conscious moments knowing that everything he'd built, every bit of power he'd accumulated, every assumption of superiority he'd held, meant nothing in this kitchen with this woman. When it was over, when the last sounds had faded and the oil had finally stilled, Patience cleaned her tools with the same precision she used for regular cooking, banked the fires, organized the kitchen. She worked until midnight, until everything was spotless, until the only evidence was in the copper kettle itself, and that was evidence that told its own story. Then she removed her apron, folded it neatly on the kitchen table, and walked out of the Cavendish mansion for the last time. She walked down Mount Vernon Street, down the hill toward the harbor, through streets she'd rarely seen in 16 years because enslaved people, even in free Massachusetts, didn't wander. She walked to Long Wharf, to the exact spot where she'd watched that ship depart in August. The December night was cold enough that her breath formed clouds in the air. The harbor was dark, dotted with lights from ships at anchor. Patience reached into her dress pocket and pulled out 2 items she'd kept hidden for 4 months. A small rag doll that Mercy had made when she was 6, sewn from scraps of fabric, loved so much that its features had worn smooth, and a tiny wooden boat that Samuel had carved when he was 9, painted blue and red, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. She set both items carefully on the dock, side by side. Then she removed a folded paper from her other pocket, a letter she'd written laboriously over the past month, having taught herself to read and write by stealing books from Master Harrison's library over the years and studying them by candlelight. The letter detailed everything: the illegal sale of her children, the names of 17 other Beacon Hill families who maintained contracted servants for life, who were enslaved people in everything but name, the financial records she'd seen while cleaning the study, proving the sale to Charleston, the truth behind Massachusetts's proud claim to have abolished slavery, while wealthy families simply renamed it. Patience had addressed the letter to William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of The Liberator, the abolitionist newspaper. She'd heard Master Harrison curse Garrison's name often enough to know he was a man who might actually care about 2 children sold south from free Massachusetts. She placed the letter in a leather pouch, weighted it with a stone, and left it prominently on the dock where it would be found by morning workers. Then she looked out at the water one more time. "I did it for you," she whispered to the darkness, to Mercy and Samuel wherever they were, to the spirits of her ancestors, to the part of herself that had died in that cellar in August. "No one else will suffer by their hands. Rest knowing your mother fought." Then Patience Willard walked into the December night and vanished. She was never seen in Boston again. The bodies were discovered the next morning when the Irish butler returned to work and found the house silent. He investigated, found the kitchen, found the copper kettle, and ran screaming into the street. Within an hour, the constable arrived. By noon, half of Beacon Hill had heard that something terrible had happened at the Cavendish mansion, though the details were being suppressed. By evening, William Lloyd Garrison had received an anonymous delivery of a leather pouch containing a letter that would change Massachusetts' legal history. He published excerpts in The Liberator within the week, careful to omit the details of the deaths but highlighting the illegal sale of children from supposedly free Massachusetts to the slave markets of Charleston. The scandal was enormous. 17 Beacon Hill families scrambled to produce paperwork proving their contracted servants were there legally. Most couldn't. Massachusetts was forced to pass the Transparency and Servitude Act of 1822, requiring public registration of all service contracts and making the kind of disguised slavery the Cavendish family had practiced impossible to maintain. But the full story of how the Cavendish family died was suppressed. The families involved didn't want it known. The city of Boston didn't want it known. Even abolitionists hesitated to publish details that might make their cause look barbaric. The official record stated only, 5 members of the Cavendish family died of poisoning by an unknown assailant, December 1821. The truth survived only in whispers. In the black community of Boston's North End, the story was told carefully, quietly, passed from mother to daughter, father to son. The story of Patience Willard, who'd cooked for her masters for 16 years and then cooked her masters, who'd proved that even the most powerless person, pushed beyond endurance, could fight back. who'd vanished into freedom or death. No one was sure which, and it didn't matter because she'd already won. In 1851, when Frederick Douglass visited Boston for a speaking engagement, an elderly black woman approached him after his speech at Faneuil Hall. She was 80-some years old, bent with age, but her eyes were sharp. "I knew Patience," she whispered, gripping Douglass's arm. "I worked with her. She taught me to cook when I was young." "What happened to her?" Douglass asked. "After that night?" The old woman smiled. "She went north, all the way north. Heard she died of old age in Montreal in 1845. Heard she lived free for 24 years after Boston. Heard she opened a boarding house and taught other women to cook. Taught them to read and write too. Taught them that survival is resistance, and sometimes resistance requires methods that civilized people don't want to discuss." Did she ever speak of her children? Every day until she died. She wore Mercy's doll in Samuel's boat on a cord around her neck. Never took it off. Never stopped mourning. But she also never stopped fighting. That's what Patience taught us. You can mourn and fight at the same time. Grief doesn't have to mean submission. Douglass later wrote in his diary about that conversation, though he never published it. "I cannot condone what she did. I cannot celebrate it. But I understand it. When law provides no justice, when society protects the powerful and abandons the powerless, when mothers are forced to watch their children stolen and are expected to smile and serve dinner afterward, what remains except the terrible justice of the oppressed?" The Cavendish mansion stood empty for 3 years after the deaths. No one wanted to buy it. Eventually, it was sold at auction to a shipping merchant from New York who didn't know the history. He lasted 6 months before selling again. The house changed hands 4 times in 10 years. Each owner reported strange occurrences. The smell of cooking oil when no one was in the kitchen. The sound of a woman crying in the cellar. Locked doors found standing open in the morning. In 1835, the mansion was demolished entirely. The lot remained empty for 20 years. Finally, in 1855, a church was built on the site. Trinity Church still stands there today on Mount Vernon Street, though few of its congregation know what happened on that ground in December 1821. But in Boston's black community, the memory persists. Every December, some families leave a small offering at the old Long Wharf, now rebuilt and modernized, but still the same harbor, the same water, flowers often, small toys sometimes, symbols of children lost to slavery's cruelty, symbols of a mother who refused to accept what was done to her. The story of Patience Willard raises questions that have no comfortable answers. Was what she did murder or justice? In legal terms, murder clearly. Premeditated, brutal, methodical. 5 people dead by her hand. But in moral terms, when the law itself is unjust, when legal systems protect evil and punish resistance, where does justice come from? Patience answered that question in a kitchen on a December night in 1821. She answered it with methods that horrify us because they should horrify us. Violence is always horrifying. The question is whether we reserve our horror only for the violence of the powerless, or whether we also feel it for the violence of the powerful, the violence that steals children from mothers, the violence that calls human beings property, the violence of slavery itself. Massachusetts prided itself on being better than the South. Patience proved that hidden cruelty is still cruelty, that calling slavery by another name doesn't make it less evil, that eventually, inevitably, the oppressed will find ways to resist. And sometimes that resistance will be just as brutal as the oppression that spawned it. The copper kettle was eventually recovered from the mansion and melted down. No record exists of what became of Mercy and Samuel in Charleston. Most likely they lived and died in bondage, never knowing what their mother had done to avenge their theft. Or perhaps word reached them somehow, through the whisper networks that connected enslaved communities across the country. Perhaps they heard about the family business dinner that went terribly wrong. Perhaps they understood. What we know for certain is this. On August 15, 1821, 2 children were stolen from their mother and sold into Southern slavery, despite Massachusetts law. On December 20, 1821, 5 people died in ways that mirrored the brutality they'd inflicted on others. On December 21, 1821, a woman named Patience Willard disappeared, and despite extensive searches, was never found by Boston authorities. And in the years that followed, Massachusetts was forced to confront the hypocrisy of its free status, while wealthy families continued to hold people in bondage with legal loopholes. Those loopholes closed, Slowly, imperfectly, but they closed. Not because of moral awakening, because of fear. Fear that if it could happen to the Cavendish family, prosperous and powerful and protected by law and custom, it could happen to anyone. Patience Willard proved that the most dangerous person in any system of oppression is not the rebel who fights openly, but the one who waits, who learns, who becomes so trusted, so invisible, so perfect that no one questions their presence in the house, their access to the family, their knowledge of routines and weaknesses. The one who understands that patience isn't submission, it's preparation. Her story is not a lesson in how to live, but it is a testimony to what happens when human beings are pushed beyond the limits of endurance, when love is weaponized against mothers, when the law itself becomes an accomplice to evil, when civilization is just a mask covering systematic cruelty. On December 20th, every year, somewhere in Boston, someone tells this story. Usually in whispers, usually in private, but it gets told. Because some truths are too important to forget, even when they're uncomfortable. Especially when they're uncomfortable. The enslaved woman who took revenge on her owner. The secret that shook Boston in 1821. The mother who proved that docility is not the same as defeat. That submission is not the same as acceptance. That justice delayed by law will eventually be delivered by other means. Patience Willard cooked for the Cavendish family for 16 years. On her final night in their kitchen, she cooked them too. That is not a comfortable truth, but it is a true truth. And 200 years later, we're still trying to understand what it means.